One of my biggest learnings about peace processes is that the most challenging part of the process is often the dynamics behind the table rather than across the table. People pay a lot of attention to the dynamics across the table, but in fact, repeatedly we see that where things get really badly messed up is with the conflicts that are taking place behind the table. So in South Africa, we had Buthelezi versus ANC. In the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine, we have Hamas and Fatah. You can go down the list in a wide variety of places. People tend to think that we will worry about the issues across the table first, and then if there's stuff behind the table, we'll sort it out later. And it doesn't actually work that way. Every process is different, but usually things get worse with time behind the table rather than better. Because if the process proceeds across the table, then there's more at stake, and there's parties are beginning to think about entering into power, and so they're competing on all sides. So that's one of the first things that I always ask people about quietly and encourage people to take seriously. What are you doing to address the issues that are dividing brother from brother behind the table? They are always there. They take different shapes and forms, but they're in every process I've ever worked in, and they are often awkward to talk about because people are embarrassed. There's often some pretty sad stories as well. So it's not fun to talk about or think about. But they can be addressed if people are willing to work on them. And my encouragement is always to begin to work on those. They cannot all be resolved here and now, but there needs to be an outreach somehow. There should be an ongoing effort. And sometimes the dynamics of the big process across the table give people a lot of motivation to really work on what's going on behind the table. Another thing that I have realized is that contrary to people's natural expectations, it's usually better if the other side are good negotiators rather than bad negotiators. I think there's especially a tendency for governments to sort of hope that these armed groups or ethnic groups who are on the other side of the table are not very effective, and often the people on that side of the table do not have resources for workshops and training. They've not been running government ministries. They've often been out there in very difficult circumstances, and they don't have the kind of training and sophistication that people from a government background often bring into talks. The truth is that the more effective and skilled and prepared those people are to enter into the process thoughtfully and with good preparation, the better off everyone is. And there are circumstances, several places around the world, where governments came to that insight rather early and made a considered decision to support possibilities for their opponents across the table to receive training and receive technical support in negotiation skills and in understanding the legal and administrative and political aspects of things that they were negotiating, to get a high level of support and preparation for negotiation processes. The interesting reward of that is it brings stability and a little more predictability to the negotiations process. It can make things more complicated at certain points because the negotiators may take a stand on things that they were not taking a stand on before. But as far as the overall conduct and atmosphere of the negotiators and their willingness to actually be problem-focused and to look at standard international principles for resolving things, in all those areas, preparation and training actually increases the stability and the effectiveness of the negotiations process. So that is a learning that one often sees that the parties themselves have not yet absorbed that, and sometimes only see it late in the game, sometimes sadly after the dynamics have really gotten difficult. And it's one that I'm hoping that perhaps could be recognized here. Another learning that I've absorbed about peace processes is about the challenges of managing the international support and resources that are available. There's a tendency to go to one of two extremes. Sometimes we see that people in a national context who are being offered all kinds of workshops and training and money and technical support, the flood of resources that are attracted to a big process can be overwhelming. And sometimes people go to an extreme and they're taking junkets all over the world to visit all kinds of places. They're setting up all kinds of processes. They are they're inviting a lot of international resource people who are doing workshops and who are staffing a lot of local activities to such an extent that there's a feeling of an industry almost that's taking over. And a lot of resources are spent that are going into the pockets of international NGOs and consultants rather than into building up the human resources of locals. There's always a lot of knowledge and resource in every country that can be drawn upon and expanded. And so, of course, one wants to direct financial resources towards building up and expanding those rather than putting that in the money in the pockets of people who disappear. So I think there is, on one hand, that tendency to go overboard with the use of the internationals. There is sometimes a reaction in the opposite direction, where there's a kind of a very strong nationalist feeling, a certain feeling of pride. Who are all these outsiders? What do they know? We don't need any help. Thank you very much. We're going to deal with this. And while I think that instinct is actually a pretty healthy one, because that's about nation building and nations should be about nation building, it is also not a realistic one, because there are quite a number of challenging issues which are very difficult for countries to deal with after a long conflict without external assistance, because trust is very low. All the people from the national context have a history and an identity. They come from somewhere in the country. They are connected to some ethnic group. They have a certain educational background. Whatever it is, there are certain issues in which it's very hard to find people with both the personal skills and the expertise and the neutrality that's required to be involved in those things. To insist we will do everything by ourselves, it can really cut a country off from expert assistance that can make a huge difference in building trust in a time when you don't have a lot of time to waste. You need to just get certain mechanisms and processes moving forward. Judicious use of international experts is, in my view, very much to a country's benefit. The challenge is where do you draw the lines? How do you choose when to bring in the people with expertise from various contexts elsewhere, and when do you say, this one, we definitely have the skills that we need to do it ourselves, and we have people who have the neutrality, or we can put together teams of people who, in their totality, have the neutrality and the completion required to do the job. There's one last lesson that I've thought a lot about from other peace processes that I think is often missed until it's pretty late. And that is the importance of building civil society into the national peace process. There is a tendency from people who are on the political and military side, which is where most people who are staffing the decision-making and negotiation forums come from. There is a tendency to pretty much assume that all we need to do is get our level of people into the peace process and get agreement there, and then we are good to go. And in fact, there is in every conflict there are layers of other people. There are the civil society leaders, the elders and the educators, the journalists, the professionals of many kinds, the religious leaders, people of all backgrounds who have an enormous amount to offer and in leading the nation through the processes ahead. Those people are necessary for several reasons. One is their support will be necessary to get through the difficult challenges that always lie ahead. Even after you get an agreement, you have to bring along people who've been deeply hurt by war and are mistrustful. And you need the support of middle-level leaders to help win support at grassroots level for the agreement, whatever it is. There's another critical reason for their involvement. Peace processes are a journey. There is an evolutionary process. People who enter into those processes often have made certain decisions within themselves, and maybe we're going to release somebody from prison, or we're going to enter into talks with someone that we considered the enemy for many years. So they have often done something that's quite new and courageous, but they are still in a great process of change. And the implications of this courageous decision that they have taken often is not fully clear to them themselves. So in South Africa, we saw Nelson Mandela being released, but it's clear in retrospect that the white government didn't really intend to enter into all of the negotiations that in the end they did. But once they began this process, they released certain dynamics, and they themselves began to think about things they had not thought about before. And they were changed by that process. And it was not an easy process. There was crisis after crisis. The talks broke down repeatedly and were stuck for weeks or even months at a time. And during that time, leaders on all sides are struggling. What do we do? It's not working. We tried, we took risks. In that time, they need the best wisdom possible from people around them. So that means people with wisdom, with deep insight from traditions, from religious backgrounds, just wise, mature people who understand what it means to raise a family and to think about the well-being of children and grandchildren. Civil society is the place to go for those people. And if there is ongoing connections to civil society leaders, that will position the national leaders who are carrying the major responsibility for the talks, for those moments when there is a crisis and everyone has to ask what is next. And it allows the changes to happen on all sides of the table that need to happen if the process is going to succeed in the end.